Welcome to our stream 4. Everything seems to be going quite well now. I would like to introduce one of the key members of the ASV, past president and director of the solar section. When you join an astronomical society, you meet lots of people and make lots of friends over the years and share people's knowledge. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Russell Cockman, who has a great passion for the sun and is an extraordinary solar section director in his efforts to bring the sun to the people. So enjoy.
For those very flattering words, I do appreciate that. Thank you. And when you get to my age, you've got all this knowledge, and you just have to share it with others. And sometimes I get a little bit overexcited about it. But welcome to this live solar demonstration from the relatively sunny skies of Elwood, about 6 kilometres from the central business district of Melbourne. Now, a word of warning before we start having a view of the sun, because direct observation of the sun can be very, very dangerous. It can permanently damage your eyes. So please never look at the sun through a telescope, binoculars, or with your naked eyes unless you have proper solar filtration to protect your eyes from the brilliant sunlight, but most importantly, from the very damaging sun's heat. So please never do it. And of course, only do it if you have equipment which is specially filtered against those dangers, and therefore safeguard your eyes and also your equipment. So today we're going to have a look at the sun in the beautiful light of hydrogen alpha, a red light. Hopefully you were looking in on John Wilkinson's excellent presentation today on the solar cycle 25. And this equipment that I will use today, it belongs to the ASV, and it's a beautiful solar telescope. It will produce views very similar to what John has provided, with the one exception that the camera I use, a video camera, is a monochrome camera. In other words, it's not a color camera, it's just in shades of black and white. Because curiously, when you look at a red sun, it's all to do with trying to distinguish features which are perhaps a slightly brighter red or a slightly darker red. And that can be very, very hard to do, given that the hydrogen alpha wavelength is in the deep red, getting towards the limit of what our eye can easily detect. So by observing the sun in shades of grey, it helps to improve the contrast, and the eye is not distracted so much by color. So anyway, let's make a start. Thanks for joining us. So you can see the screen there. It looks very, very blank. So let's see if we can find the sun in the field of view. So what I'm going to do is increase the exposure on our camera, and there we go. There's the sun, very, very overexposed, a little bit off the edge of the field. So I'm just going to move the telescope mount to bring the sun into the field of view. Here we go. The telescope is on a mount which is pretty close to polar aligned, but there's just a little bit of drift. So I'm just moving the telescope, and here's our very, very, very overexposed sun. So I'll just crank back on the exposure a little bit. As you can see, it's very, very fuzzy. That's because it needs to be focused. So now I'm going to focus the telescope. And hopefully the sun will, here we go, it's starting to sharpen up. And there we are. That's a rough focus. So already we can start to see, hopefully my cursor shows up, an active region here, a number of sunspots in this active region. And as you learned today from John Wilkinson's presentation, each of these active regions has been given a number, so it can be studied and monitored and referred back over time. So this is AR2880, collection of sunspots with a little bit of white area around it. That is some minor explosive activity taking place on the sun. What else have we got? Oh, it looks like there's a sunspot over here coming into view, I think, or maybe going. Never too sure in this orientation. I do apologize. But the contrast is a little bit low. So what I'm going to do is just play around with this thing called gamma and just crank it right way up to the max. And that tends to stretch the shades of grey, makes the whites a little bit whiter, makes the darks a little bit darker, and consequently I'll just increase the exposure a little bit. So now you can see the sun a little bit more contrasty, and you can see all this light and shade over the disk. And just to remind you what John said earlier, hydrogen alpha telescopes, we don't see that brilliant, dazzling sun that we see in the daytime. That's light coming from a region or a layer of the sun called the photosphere. But what we're looking at is a layer about 10,000 kilometers above that layer called the chromosphere. Chromo meaning colored. And the only other time that we can safely see the chromosphere with our naked eyes is during a total solar eclipse, when the moon does the job of completely blocking all that brilliant photospheric light and heat. And the chromosphere appears as a very beautiful radiant red band, a second or two before totality absolutely begins, and a second or two before totality ends. And it's the most beautiful color, the chromosphere. And as John pointed out, the advantage of looking at the sun in hydrogen alpha and looking at the sun's chromosphere is that we can see these flames of solar stuff, so-called prominences, jutting into space. And although we can't see any prominences here at the moment, we will see some prominences as we go through this demonstration. So here is our sun. So let's focus in. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to crank up the exposure even more to overexpose the disk of the sun. And that will show us some prominences around the edge. Here we go. You can see them starting to pop into visibility. Quite a few of them. A large region prominences here, some over here, some there. Pretty much all the way around the solar disk are these prominences. But hopefully you're learning that because I've had to increase the exposure and overexpose the sun's disk to show the prominences, that means that the prominences are a little bit fainter than the disk of the sun, and that's all to do with the differing temperatures of the disk of the sun and prominences and active regions, etc. And we're only talking about a few hundred degrees Celsius either way of average. Average temperature is about 5,500 degrees Celsius. But that subtle difference in color is all that is required in order to make things appear white or darker. So let's return our exposures to normal. Get that beautiful solar disk there, and let's zoom in on this active region here. And I can do that just by creating a little sub window and zooming in on it. And there we are. Now there's that active region 2880, and I'm going to do a little bit of fine focus on it. And there we are. That looks pretty nice indeed. So we're seeing 3 sunspots. Sunspot here, 2 sunspots there. They appear dark, and that darkness is really only an effect of contrast. These sunspots, if we could see them isolated from the rest of the sun, they would still be as dazzlingly bright as the rest of the chromosphere. It is only a matter of contrast. And the same goes for these slightly whiter areas around here. These are a few hundred degrees warmer. And that's because energy is being liberated through, explosions on the sun, to put it as bluntly as I possibly can. But have a look at all this beautiful fine structure around here. That is all real structure on the sun's chromosphere. It's not dust on the chip of the camera or dust on the lens of the telescope or some sort of falsehood created by the computer. No, this is real and genuine structure on the sun's photosphere. How lovely is that? And there are actually structures within structures, because over here, well separated from the sunspots, the structures are just like little cells of of dark surrounded by a little bit of white. But as we get closer to the sunspots, the chromosphere tends to take on swirly structures, larger areas of activity, swirling features like this, and you can see it's beautifully structured, and it's different for every group of sunspots, and it changes hour by hour. Our sun is a dynamic star. Now, looking at, and I should point out, you can see that the image is sort of wobbling around a little bit. That's not because the sun's surface is boiling or doing anything like that. That is simply down to the Earth's atmosphere. We astronomers on the ground are always looking through the Earth's atmosphere at objects in the sky, and the Earth's atmosphere has various air currents in it, which tend to change the direction of light passing through, only by little bits, but it makes the image tend to move around and get a little bit distorted, comes in fuzzy and goes out sharp, that kind of thing. So it's simply a fact that we're looking through the Earth's atmosphere at the sun. And of course, the Earth's atmosphere is less steady during daytime because the sun is beating down on the Earth's surface, heating up the land, causing the air above that warmer land to rise up, and that's where those air currents come from. So what a beautiful feature we're looking at here. Now, I'm just going to zoom in a little bit closer on that sunspot here. I can't get that image any larger, unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, and girls and boys. But if you have a look at that sunspot very, very carefully, towards the lower right, you can see a little white band separating two areas of dark. Now, that's not because that sunspot is actually split into two halves. That's because it's actually one sunspot, but there's a little arc of hotter solar stuff going from the upper right to the bottom of that, and so that band of brighter sun stuff appears to cut that sunspot in half.
Russell, we have a question from Gunnar. He wants to know what the bulbous looking areas close to the sunspots are.
The bulbous areas, right. The bulbous areas.
I'd say that the shaky areas, I'd say, coming next to the sunspots there.
Are we talking about these areas here?
Yeah, the ones close to the sunspots. I'd say that's what he's talking about.
These areas here. Well,
yeah,
that's a good question. Thanks very much for that. It's a little bit technical, but this is we can stray into technical areas. The sun is a huge ball of very hot plasma, charged particles, and because of the internal motions inside the sun, those motions of plasma create magnetic fields, and the magnetic fields push up through the sun's photosphere and into the chromosphere, and where they break through, that causes the areas around those magnetic fields to become slightly cooler, and we see those as sunspots. So sunspots are a visible indication of what the sun's magnetic fields are doing, and that explains why these areas around the sunspots tend to be structured, etc., because the magnetic fields not only come out, but they go sort of radially along the layer of the sun's chromosphere as well. And it's a fact of life that when there's a magnetic field around, plasma has to follow those magnetic field lines, and hence all these structures here is really a representation of what the sun's magnetic field looks like if we could see it. We don't need to see it because we can just follow what the plasma is doing. So I hope that answers the question. So yes, you can see the that little band of white cutting that sunspot in half. I'll get my cursor out of the way so you can see it. And these areas of white here are tiny or slight explosions on the sun. I have to be careful with my terms here because slight refers to relative to the amount of energy that the sun can liberate, but certainly not slight compared with the energies that we are familiar with. So although these explosions are relatively small compared with the sun, they could be about 1 million times the energy of an atom bomb going off. So I would not like to be around when 1 million atom bombs go off. Thanks very, very much. So it's all relative, but that just gives you an idea of the prodigious amount of energy that the sun is producing every second of every day, and has done so for the last 5 billion years, and will continue to do so for the next 5 billion years. Fabulous stuff. And within these areas, these little white areas, there's actually a name given to them. They're called Ellerman bombs. It's like solar stuff is raised up and then falls back into the sun's chromosphere, and where that stuff hits the chromosphere, it makes it a little bit hotter, and hence shines a little bit brighter than the surrounding area. So a lot happening. So the air is steadied down quite a bit, getting some lovely views there.
Russell,
now,
we've got a
yes,
couple of questions for you. Frank Marion wants to know what's the diameter of these sunspots we're looking at?
very good, Frank. And I was almost getting to that, but thank you very much for that reminder. To answer that, I'll go back to the full sun. Went there, and there we are, our full sun. Here we are. Now there's the diameter of our sun. It's pretty much a perfect sphere, ever so slightly flattened at the poles and a little bit bulgy at the equator. North is up here and west is there to set up the cardinal points on the sun. But across the diameter of the sun, that is 1.4 million kilometers. 1.4 million kilometers across there. And given that the diameter of the Earth is about 14,000 kilometers, that means about 109 Earths could fit across this diameter of the sun. 109 Earths. So when you have a look at the sunspot here, you think, oh, it's pretty small, but you're comparing it with the size of the sun. But when you compare that sunspot with the size of the Earth, I reckon you could probably fit 2 or 3 Earths inside that. Imagine that. Imagine if somehow or other we could protect ourselves from the heat and the light, and we could transport our Earth close to the sun, and our Earth would be swallowed by that sunspot. Just to give you an idea of how large the sun is in comparison with the Earth. So I hope that answers your question, Frank.
There's another one for you as well. Averton Engineering asking, are you saying the lines of flux when you're talking about the flux? Was it flux earlier, just before?
Magnetic flux, yeah. Lines of magnetic
flux?
force, yeah.
Yep.
Yes. So was that just to confirm that
I think so, yes.
magnetic flux is... Yep. So magnetic flux is sort of encompasses the direction of the magnetic field, plus also the intensity of the magnetic field. And while these fields are relatively small by universal standards, nevertheless, plasma has to follow those magnetic lines of force. So it gives us good insights into how local the sun's magnetic field is. I should also point out the sun has a dipolar magnetic field, so it comes out of the North Pole, magnetic North Pole, and comes around like that and goes into the south, both sides, and in a three-dimensional structure. But because of the internal workings of the sun, the energy is created in the core, deep down in the middle of the sun, and that energy eventually comes to a region where the energy is transported by convection, which means hot gas rises up. As it rises up, it cools. The cool gas then flows back down. That convection transfers energy from a particular region to the surface, and by convection, that means that gas is moving up and therefore moving down, and that is the perfect scenario for creating magnetic fields, plasma on the move. So magnetic fields force plasma to follow them, and moving plasma creates magnetic fields as a consequence. So our sun is just a huge magnet, and as John pointed out today, our sun's 11/22 year cycle of activity is a magnetic cycle of activity. We measure the activity from point of view of measuring the number of sunspots, and those sunspots are a direct measure of how much magnetism, the internal magnetism the sun has that can break through to the surface. So by measuring sunspots, we were inadvertently measuring something far more fundamental about the sun, its magnetic variability over a 22-year, roughly, cycle. How good is that? Okay, so we've had a look at that. Let's see if we can have a closer look in at this filament up here, right on the very edge of the sun. Just here. So for some of you, filament may be a new term. I've mentioned the word prominence. So prominences are bits of solar stuff that are seen projected into space. But imagine a prominence that is projected onto the radiating surface of the sun. Prominences being slightly cooler, a little bit darker than the average temperature. So a prominence seen against the hotter and brighter solar disk will appear slightly darker. So these filaments are simply prominences seen silhouetted or seen superimposed against the brighter radiating surface of the sun. One here and another one up here, and a little bit of activity being derived there. So, and generally, filaments are a lot of fun because they can be tiny or they can be huge, covering up to 500,000 kilometers in extent. And that's outrageous. They're a lot of fun. And once again, all that lovely light and shade that you see there is structures or are structures in the sun chromosphere. Hot gas rising up, cooling, and then flowing back down to be heated up again, just doing this endless cycle. Hot gas rising, cool gas falling down, falling back down. Keep those questions coming. There's our sun. As you can see, I need to keep correcting just to keep the sun in the field of view. Another active region over here. Now, as John pointed out earlier today, the sun has only, over the last couple of years, just woken up from a period of solar minimum. And so its activity day by day, month by month, will steadily rise. Not steadily, it'd be fairly erratic, until solar maximum occurs end of 2024 or into 2025, when there'll be lots and lots and lots of large sunspots, lots and lots and lots of beautiful prominences around the edge, and there'll be lots of flares as well. These explosions of on the surface on the sun, where magnetic lines of force reconnect, and all that energy is suddenly released in an atomic explosion of millions of atom bombs, which just blasts solar stuff into space. And that's called space weather, when this solar stuff gets blasted into space. So here's a little bit of a little warm spot here, and some slightly darker areas, more chromospheric material. Not so interesting compared with that active region we were looking at earlier.
Russell,
So
we have another question. We have another question for
Certainly.
you.
Fire
Benno
away.
wants to know, where are we in the sun's 11-year cycle between maxima and minima sun activity?
Lovely question. And so solar minimum for the last cycle, or between last cycle and this cycle, was towards the end of 2019. And now we're getting towards the end of 2021. So that's about 2 years. We're 2 years into solar cycle 25. And the forecast for solar maximum is going to be something like end of 2024 or into 2025. These times aren't exactly predictable. As John mentioned, it all depends on what model solar scientists use for predicting these things. So we're and generally solar activity tends to rise exponentially. So it gets off to a slow start and then builds up fairly quickly, reaches a maximum that may last a couple of years or so, and then it starts to decline fairly quickly, and then more slowly as solar minimum approaches. So we're probably halfway, or a little bit less than halfway, from solar minimum to solar maximum for cycle 25.
I've got a question, Russell.
Certainly, Judith.
The interval of solar minimum was a little longer than expected this time round. Is that your understanding?
It all depends on what you mean by expected. That we solar scientists don't understand the sun particularly well, so really it is a case of building up more data to try to understand why there's this variability in the solar cycle, because it's not exactly 11 years, and may have been slightly longer than average. Okay, and that's probably a better way of defining it. We can look over the last 30 solar cycles and determine what the average period of solar minimum was, and okay, I think it was, and certainly one previous to that was longer than average. Took longer for the sun to in inverted commas wake up and start becoming active again, and but really the reasons for that aren't well understood, although I think as you mentioned earlier today about planetary cycles and the planetary cycles, I think there's better evidence now that the planetary cycles have a substantial impact on the cause of the solar cycle being 11 years and thereabouts. So therefore, I think those solar cycles, the planetary cycles can also impact the length of solar minimum as well. Okay, so let's crank up the exposure again. Have a look at some prominences. So this is the nicest looking area of prominences here. Let's have a focus on those.
Well, that's a good one.
It is a beauty, isn't it? And I think, ladies and gentlemen, when we were talking about the size of the sun compared with the size of the Earth, I don't know, maybe a dozen, 15 Earths might fit along the length of that prominence. And please bear in mind, we're only getting a two-dimensional view of this feature. We're not quite sure, I'm not quite sure how it extends towards us or away from us. So it could be a much more substantial feature than how it meets the eye. But I can tinker around with exposures just to give you a feel for how subtle and how structured the prominences are. Just subtly changing the exposures. Now, also, if you, with a little bit of imagination, you may almost consider that prominence to be a loop. Because bearing in mind, when the sun's magnetic field or those local plasma-generated magnetic fields break through, they are loops. They rise up, have a bit of a look around what's happening out there, and then they go back into the sun. And these prominences will follow magnetic loops as well. So this may actually be tracing a magnetic loop, and it's actually that magnetic loop which holds that prominence up, stops it from falling back down. Just adjusting the position.
So you have a question which I think you're answering at the moment. Doug's asking, what are the faculae, those white or lighter streaks seen in the white light observations? Are they solar flares?
Very, very good question. And all I can say is they are just slightly hotter regions of the solar photosphere in the white light. Because notice that the faculae are more easily detected when they're on the edge of the sun, and the sun actually has a bit of limb darkening, meaning the limb of the sun is slightly darker than the center of the sun. So that slight darkening of the towards the limb of the sun helps to make these faculae a little bit more easy to see because of enhanced contrast. But the fact of the matter is, they're a little bit lighter than the surrounding sun, so therefore they're going to be a little bit hotter. So they're evidence of some form of energy release in that particular area, and quite often faculae transform into sunspots over time. So that's about all I can say on that. But
so we also have Mark Sanson asking, what if if that prominence was directly facing Earth? Would it be large enough to produce an aurora for us?
Well, that's a leading question, Mark. I'd love to say yes, but sorry, I don't wish to be elusive or evasive, but it all depends. Okay, there are a number of mechanisms by which solar stuff can reach Earth, and hence lead to displays of the southern lights and the aurora australis, or the northern lights, the aurora borealis. One of those is a sunspot group exploding and sending a coronal mass ejection towards Earth. Another example is a filament, perhaps on the center of the sun, Earth directed, a filament which collapses. In other words, the magnetic field lines which are holding that filament up suddenly reconnect, and all that reconnection energy just blasts that filament into space. So all that stuff that was just suspended there over the sun, and quite happily, I would say, suddenly gets released into space and adds to the solar wind, and that gust of wind passing by Earth can easily lead to displays of the aurorae. So, as I said, it all depends on whether that filament stays suspended or it collapses, and so that's why I'm saying it all depends. It just depends on the circumstances.
So we got another question for you, Russell. I'm bombarding you with them at the moment.
I love questions. I find the answers harder to.
He's got another one. Does the strength of the magnetic field decide the shape and size of the protuberance?
Well,
we've stumped him.
I would have to say, I'd say by and large yes, but the size of the prominence, protuberance, will depend on the magnitude of the explosion, the amount of energy released in the explosion that blasted that stuff into space. But also, the strength of the magnetic field is required in order to hold that prominence in its position. So it occurs both ways. Yes, I would say it's the magnetic field strength which keeps these prominences bright and keeps them together, stops them from dispersing. And it's also the strength of the magnetic fields which led to the flare or the explosion that blasted this stuff into space. So pretty much all of the prominences we see today, they're not going to end up in space. They're just going to follow their magnetic field lines back into the sun's chromosphere, ultimately into the photosphere, and rejoin the body of the sun. Fantastic questions. Keep them coming. So lovely prominence there. I don't know what else I can do with it, really. I can blow up can increase the gain so you can see some very much fainter little outliers here, some here and some there. These prominences are incredibly structured, the finest of structures. They are absolutely beautiful, and please spend some time going to spaceweather.com or solar sites on Facebook, for example, to see some absolutely fabulous, finely detailed views of prominences. You won't regret it.
We have another question from Doug on YouTube. A solar prominence is different to a coronal mass ejection, isn't it? Don't the magnetic field lines have to break to release a flare?
Absolutely correct. Yes, a coronal mass ejection is the result of an explosion on the sun, and basically it's just blasts stuff into space as a huge often a spherical cloud of stuff which radiates at 360 degrees outwards from the sun. May contain several billion tons of solar stuff. And it's generally flares that create the most powerful coronal mass ejections, because it's flares that release the most amount of energy. And once again, spaceweather.com probably once a week or so will show a coronal mass ejection that has been photographed from one of the solar observatories up in space, and these are just mesmerizing to watch. These coronal mass ejections. So I think that's answered it. But if not, I'm happy to add a little bit more.
You can add as much as
Just
you
in
want.
that first group of sunspots that you're showing us, Russell, just before you said comments about the curved loops, I felt that I could actually see the curved loop of joining some of the spots. I didn't know if it was my imagination or wishful thinking, but it did look like to me I could actually see a very fine loop there from joining the spots.
Yes, Judith, it wasn't your imagination, no, and they are there. These snaky magnetic field lines that the plasma follows, and tends to cool down the region of the sun that these are passing through, so that makes them stand out a little bit. And we've got some cloud coming through now, ladies and gentlemen. But yes, and if the seeing was any better, i.e. the stability of the Earth's atmosphere, we would be able to make these out very well indeed. But the beauty of taking a video, ladies and gentlemen, is that a video can be recorded, and at the moment I can record about 60 frames per second. So that's 60 pictures of the sun, from active group or whatever, 60 images of the sun every second, and I may collect 1,000 frames in my video. And there are programs out there which will take the video as an input, and then split up that video into all those still frames, and then select the sharpest frames, and maybe as 400 or 500 sharp frames, and then stack them all up and put them together, and you come up with the most detailed and awesome still photo, which, as Judith has alluded to, you can actually start to see the loops of the magnetism arcing around these sunspots. So in many ways, our Earth's atmosphere tends to fuzz out some of the structures and makes them less visible. But by clever computer programs and taking videos, one can select the sharpest frames, i.e. the ones that haven't been affected by atmospheric seeing as much, or perhaps none at all, and just use those and throw out the ones that have been badly affected, and come up with a beautifully structured photo of the sun. And really, it's incredible. This is just a 4-inch telescope we've got here, and I can just by taking a video and processing it, come up with a sun that's just wonderful to behold, if I don't say so myself. Anyway, look, there's the clouds coming through. There's the clouds going away now. But yes, Judith, you can see some curvy bits around here, for example.
Yes, yes, I can definitely see a loop there.
Curves around here, something up here. Yep. So you can see wherever there's a sunspot group, the structures become a little bit more ordered compared with just a general region on the sun's surface. And that's simply because the magnetic fields are forcing order in that area. You can see again that light bridge across that sunspot. I was hoping to see a flare today as the sun's activity is rising. The sun is popping off low energy flares pretty much all the time, but not at the apparently not at the moment, because these flares only last 10, 15 minutes, 20 minutes. So you've really got to be looking at the sun at that particular moment in time when these things pop off. And I'm mindful of Richard Carrington, who was observing the sun in 1859. He was looking at the sun safely. He was projecting the sun onto a wall, and he was perplexed because a sunspot he was looking at, it was a very complex sun and a very complex sunspot. That sunspot drastically changed its shape almost in an instant. And what Carrington was seeing was a massive flare taking place out of that sunspot region. Bearing in mind, sunspots are dark, flares are white. So when a flare erupts from a sunspot group, it tends to blot out some of the structures in the sunspot. And he was very, very perplexed about that a sunspot could change its structure so quickly. But 18 hours later, there were absolutely worldwide displays of the aurora borealis and aurora australis, pretty much covering the entire planet because of the coronal mass ejection of that flare blasted into space. And people were able to read newspapers at night under auroral light, for example. It was just the most incredible experience. And we will likely see them again. Now, this looks fairly new. Little filamentary feature just appeared there.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So there we have it.
We've got someone asking if you have any photos of flares that you've captured.
Oh, I shall, unfortunately, not on this computer. And flares, they only appear as white spots. All right, it's not as if they're either, they're 1 minute they're not there, the next minute, oh, there's a bright spot has suddenly appeared, and that's what a flare looks like. And as I said, you have to be lucky to get one, and the flares that I have picked up have been relatively low energy ones, about C class. I'm looking very forward to picking up an X class flare, I reckon, because that would be pretty awesome to do. But I don't spend all my time looking at the sun. I do have a life away from the sun, but generally I rely on spaceweather.com to let me know what has happened on the sun, just out of interest, because although the sun is a nearest star, the star that we can see most clearly, we can't, like Professor Fluke mentioned earlier today, astronomers, they just don't have the time to just stand at the eyepiece or watch their monitors 24/7. They have other aspects of their life that they need to indulge in, like eating and sleeping, for example. Not quite indulgences, but anyway, geez, I tend to waffle on. But
I don't know, Russell. Some people indulge in sleeping.
Some do, correct? Yes, some do.
I don't think we've. Oh, hang on. Here we go. Yep, got one from Doug. A question.
Hello,
a
Doug.
Carrington event would be a worldwide major disaster now, wouldn't it?
Yes. Next question, please.
Yes, is a very
nice. Clearly, Doug is very knowledgeable. I think he's trying to test my knowledge. Good on you, Doug. Look, yes, one of the features of the Carrington event, or at least 18 hours later to a day later, was that in those days, remember, they used the telegraph for communication. Electrical conductors on top of wooden poles, etc., and that was their modern, internet of those days. And as this solar storm passed by, bearing in mind that solar storm is carrying a huge magnetic field with it, And that magnetic field can interact with the Earth's magnetic field and channel particles towards the poles. As those particles are channeling towards the poles, they're creating their own magnetic fields, and that can set up currents in the Earth and set up currents in these electrical conductors, because they are fabulous aerials for converting magnetic energy into electrical energy. And it was evident that some of the poles were catching fire, that the telegraph wires were arcing, just shorting out. The operators were getting shocks from the equipment because of the high voltages established in the equipment. And in fact, they turned off their electrical supply, which was just batteries in those days, and they could still send messages through the telegraph simply because of the voltages that were already existing in the equipment. Now imagine if that happened today. Our Earth is festooned with lovely aerials that can convert magnetic energy into electrical energy. We call them power lines and power distribution, etc., etc. It would be absolutely catastrophic for a Carrington event to occur, because our electrical supplies would be knocked out instantly. Our GPS satellites would be knocked out. Our communication satellites would be knocked out. And this is the main reason why the sun is being observed 24/7, year in, year out. It's not only to learn about what the sun is up to, but also to see what the sun is doing, so that our systems operators on Earth can put equipment into a safe mode that will minimize the amount of damage that a Carrington type event might or will cause to our technologies here on Earth. And please, there was a blackout in Quebec in 1989. That was simply a CME passing by, creating currents in electrical generation grid, and the whole grid tripped out to make itself fail safe. So that's, I would say, is a mini Carrington event right there. But the system was able to put itself into safe mode, and I'm still not sure why. Sorry, it was a little bit before Soho and these things, but I'm sure that event in Quebec got solar scientists very, very worried, and got them and prompted them to start sending solar observatories into space to keep a constant lookout for what the sun might be throwing at us, because it will happen again, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. It's scary.
Very scary.
How wonderful.
I think that's a very interesting point, Russell, because at the approach of solar cycle 24, and the astronomers, but just reflecting on what you just said, how scientists are a little worried about keeping track of the sun, they were predicting that it was going to be so very active. And then it turned out to be much quieter than predictions. And
Yeah.
the thing about solar cycle 24 was that there was a whole pile of technology around that wasn't around for solar cycle 23. And
Correct.
and
Yes.
and that's more so the case now with solar cycle 25.
Yes.
And if you think about the discontinued use of landlines and things like that, and our reliance on not only electricity but satellites for our information,
Yes.
we depend on iClouds and all sorts of things. It is going to be. We talked about the 1999 to 2000 technology change. Well, I think the next big technology challenge will be, in fact, an enormous coronal mass ejection on the sun.
And a solar storm, correct. And
Mm.
not every coronal mass ejection, even a very powerful one, not every coronal mass ejection will cause havoc here on Earth.
No.
Solar scientists are learning that there's a combination of events that tends to magnify the damage that a coronal mass ejection can cause. And in fact, it was 2012. If a solar storm had have passed by the Earth a week later, because the Earth wasn't in the right place, we may have had a Carrington event in July of 2012.
I'd say that means we were in the right place, not that
we were in the
weren't
right place. Correct.
We were
Yes,
in the
absolutely.
right place.
Absolutely. Yep. But if it was a week later, the Earth would have been in the wrong place, and we could have had a Carrington event right then. So solar scientists are learning a lot, but let's face it, we can't control the sun. Never can, never will.
So there's another question on that topic of solar flares. If a solar flare can damage a panel, how can I prevent the damage? You can't really prevent it, can you?
Not really. No, you can't. You can't prevent it. Well, your solar panel's not going to be that affected by it. You're thinking about electrical grids, which not only run above ground but run underground as well. So these things are very susceptible to ground currents and currents generated just because of magnetic fields passing by. So that's the main fear of countrywide disruption of electrical power generation, and especially the huge transformers that convert electricity from one voltage to another. If these transformers were seriously damaged, you just can't go to Bunnings and or JCar and get another one of these transformers and plug it in, because these things cost millions of dollars and they have to be specially made, etc., etc. And because of that, they're not no spares. So you think about that we're getting to a stage where something will happen, and really there's no solution to it. Just time, but it will happen.
One of the good arguments for having different sources of energy, I know that I treasure our gas stove when we have an electricity blackout. Having different forms of energy is a good way to go.
Absolutely, Judith, very much so. And that's the old saying, isn't it? Keeping all your eggs in one basket. You're not going to want to do that. And look, I just want to emphasize that people amongst us who have their solar panels and perhaps a wind turbine or whatever in their back garden, whatever, they're not going to be so affected by a coronal mass ejection. It's the long transmission lines, the electrical grid, that is going to be affected by it, because the long lines can generate huge voltages, which the system is not designed to cope with, and things will just fry, get burnt out, and break as a result of that. So it's not at the local level. It's more at the countrywide distribution grid level that a solar storm is going to have most impact. But what a fabulous auroral display we're going to see, ladies and gentlemen. That's the upside of this, and dark skies as well.
Oh yes, we will, won't we?
We will.
Yeah. We just won't have any phones or camera equipment or things like that, any digital equipment anyway, will we, to take photos? It'll all be...
Well, if you've got a solar panel that can give you 12 volts or whatever, you can charge up you can charge your phone up with that. But anyway, look, you wouldn't have any service. But anyway. So you doomsday preppers out there, better start stocking up on baked beans and pasta and stuff.
It's coming. I think we've gone for about an hour now, Judith.
We have, yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
We could have a break for afternoon tea, and just a little break, and come back for the afternoon session then.
So I think
at
afternoon sessions, 3:45 p.m. for a dark sky workshop, and Barry's spectrograph or spectrogram, isn't it?
Gram, yep.
Of planet Jupiter at 4:30. So 3:45 we'll be back.
So thanks everyone for joining in. It's been a lot of fun, and I hope you've enjoyed this live stream view of the sun. A rare observation you've made today, ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys. So have a good day, and please remember to come back for the afternoon session. See you later. Bye.
Thanks very much, Russell.